Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
In the autumn of 2014, on a quiet residential street in Queens, agents in windbreakers closed in on a man whose name had been whispered in New York's underworld for more than half a century. He was in his late 70s, a grandfather with thinning white hair and an old neighborhood accent, but the indictment in a Brooklyn federal courthouse described him in very different terms. A longtime participant in the Bonanno crime family, allegedly tied to one of the most famous unsolved thefts in American history, the 1978 Lufthansa heist at John F. Kennedy International Airport. For decades, that robbery had been wrapped in myth and movie scenes, millions in cash and jewels disappearing into the night, key witnesses turning up dead, and the FBI left chasing rumors. Now, prosecutors were telling a jury that the trail did not end with Hollywood, but with this aging defendant, Vincent Asaro, who sat at the defense table listening as his life story was recast as a blueprint of organized crime in Queens. To understand how a child of working-class immigrants became a symbol of that world, to understand the forces that shaped him, you have to go back to the streets where his life began. Vincent Asaro was born in New York City in the late 1930s, as the country was struggling through the final years of the Great Depression and edging toward the Second World War. His family was part of a broader wave of Sicilian and Southern Italian immigrants who had come to the United States in the early 20th century, fleeing poverty and political turmoil in the old country, and landing in crowded tenements in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and, increasingly, Queens. By the time he was a boy, the family had roots in the neighborhood of Ozone Park, not yet the fully built-up borough it would become, but a patchwork of modest row houses, corner stores, and empty lots where children played stickball under the watchful eyes of parents and grandparents who still spoke Italian at the kitchen table. Those family kitchens were the center of life for many in that generation. Meals were long, stories were repeated, and old grievances and loyalties from Sicily were kept alive. At the same time, outside those walls, a different kind of power structure was taking shape. Since the 1930s, the American Mafia, Cosa Nostra, as its members called it, had quietly consolidated its influence in New York. The Castellamare War, a violent internal conflict among Italian-American gangs, had ended years earlier with the rise of a new order under figures like Charles "Lucky" Luciano. What emerged was a federation of families, each with its own hierarchy of bosses, captains, and soldiers, claiming domains over labor racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, and other illicit forms of business. One of those organizations, the Bonanno family, drew heavily from Sicilian communities with roots in towns like Castellamare del Golfo, and its presence would loom particularly large in the neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Queens, where Asaro grew up. Later in life, prosecutors and authors would refer to Asaro as a third-generation gangster, suggesting that his ties to organized crime were not a sudden deviation, but part of a lineage in which underworld connections overlapped with family and neighborhood identity. Whatever the precise details of those early relationships, there is little dispute that he came of age in a world where legitimate hard work and illicit opportunity stood side by side, and where boys quickly learned which older men commanded deference on the street. In Ozone Park, those men were sometimes the same ones who were whispered about in connection with the Bonanno family, even if no one spoke their names too loudly outside the community. The broader context of his childhood was one of contradiction. On the one hand, America of the 1940s was mobilizing for war, and like countless other children, young Vincent would have seen victory gardens, war bond posters, and neighborhood drives for scrap metal and rubber. Many Italian-American families sent sons to the armed forces. Others worked in factories supplying the war effort. Patriotic pride mixed with lingering suspicion, Just a few years earlier, enemy alien restrictions had fallen on many Italians, and the image of Italians in the American imagination was still often shaped by stereotypes. On the other hand, within the shadows of the docks and the trucking yards, organized crime figures quietly expanded their foothold in labor unions and shipping, exploiting wartime demand and shortages to strengthen their grip on certain industries. As Ozone Park and nearby neighborhoods developed in the post-war era, the opening and expansion of Idlewild Airport, later renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport, would fundamentally reshape the local economy. Construction of the airport meant jobs for carpenters and electricians, for truck drivers and baggage handlers, and for small businesses that sprang up to serve the growing workforce. But the airport also created new temptations. Cargo moved on and off planes in vast quantities, everything from electronics and furs to cash in transit. And where cargo moved, criminal groups saw opportunity. By the late 1940s and 1950s, law enforcement reports were already noting the involvement of organized crime figures in thefts from piers and warehouses throughout the metropolitan area. The roads that ran from Ozone Park to the airport and the nearby industrial zones were not just commuter routes. They were arteries of a shadow economy. Within this shifting landscape, a boy growing into adolescence would have seen a stark contrast between the promises of post-war prosperity and the reality of working-class struggle. For many families in Queens, the dream was simple and straightforward. Honest work, maybe a small business, a better education for the children. But schooling was not always a priority in neighborhoods where immediate income could feel more urgent than long-term plans. Across New York at mid-century, dropping out of school in the early teens was far from uncommon, especially among boys who felt the pull of street life and peer groups. Records about Asaro's education are sparse in the public record, but his later criminal cases make clear that by his late teens and early 20s, his life was already intersecting with that world of informal and illegal business that flourished just beyond the radar of most law-abiding residents. The social networks that sustained that world were often built around extended families, childhood friendships, and shared regional origins from Italy. In this regard, Asaro's path fits a broader pattern seen in many mafia cases. Older men with ties to a crime family would notice younger males who showed a mix of discretion, toughness, and loyalty. Errands might begin innocently enough, keeping an eye on a parked car, delivering an envelope, running a message between two social clubs. Over time, those small tasks could lead to more serious involvement, acting as a lookout, driving a car, helping to collect debts. For someone like Asaro, whose name would decades later appear in federal indictments alongside long-established Bonanno figures, those early contacts likely blurred the line between legitimate neighbors and men for whom crime was a profession. This blurring was reinforced by the everyday visibility of mob-connected social life in parts of Queens and Brooklyn. Italian social clubs, often marked by innocuous names and modest storefronts, served as gathering places where card games, coffee, and conversation mingled with more serious discussions of business. Not every man at those tables was a criminal, and not every gathering was nefarious. But law enforcement surveillance over the years repeatedly identified such locations as informal headquarters or meeting points for crime family members. For a young man seeking status or belonging, the sense of importance radiating from those rooms, expensive suits, confident body language, the deference shown by others, could be powerful. These were men who did not seem to answer to anyone but themselves, even as they operated under a strict internal code. That code, deeply rooted in Sicilian traditions of secrecy and loyalty, would shape much of Asaro's adult life. Omerta, the code of silence, discouraged cooperation with authorities and framed outside institutions, police, courts, government, as adversaries rather than protectors. It promised protection and advancement within the group in exchange for obedience and discretion. For officials later trying to analyze his trajectory, This culture made it difficult to cleanly separate personal choice from environmental pressure. Neighborhoods like Ozone Park were not uniformly criminal. They were full of ordinary working families. But they were also places where a subculture of organized crime had taken firm root, and where stepping onto that path could sometimes feel like following a well-trodden road. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the American Mafia was reaching what many historians consider its peak influence in New York. The Commission, the informal governing body of the major New York crime families, served as a kind of underworld board of directors. The Bonanno family, still under the leadership of its namesake boss, Joseph Bonanno, controlled rackets ranging from gambling and bookmaking to construction, trucking, and distribution of stolen goods. Federal attention was slowly increasing. Televised hearings in the 1950s had exposed elements of organized crime to the national public, and the infamous 1957 Appalachian meeting, when state troopers stumbled upon a large gathering of mafia leaders in upstate New York, confirmed to skeptics that a nationwide criminal structure did indeed exist. But despite this scrutiny, day-to-day operations at the street level continued, often unimpeded, in neighborhoods like the one where Asaro lived. The public record on Asaro's specific activities in these years emerges mainly from later indictments, testimony by cooperating witnesses, and law enforcement summaries. These sources portray him as someone who, by the 1960s, was closely associated with Bonanno family figures who controlled parts of Queens, including areas near the airport. Prosecutors would later argue that this was the period in which he became firmly embedded in the family's network, involved in schemes that ranged from fraudulent credit operations to hijacking and theft from cargo facilities. They also portrayed him as someone who learned early how to blend in, living in ordinary houses, driving unremarkable cars, keeping a low public profile even as his name circulated within the underworld. If the underworld demanded secrecy, the official world was beginning to demand answers. The same years that saw his emergence in criminal circles also saw a gradual escalation in law enforcement efforts against the mafia. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, which had once largely downplayed or even denied the existence of an Italian-American organized crime structure, began devoting more resources to wiretaps, informants, and surveillance of social clubs and meeting places. State and city police, too, were under pressure to address corruption and criminal infiltration in dock work, trucking, and unions. For men like Asaro, this meant that the old days of operating almost entirely in the shadows were changing. Conversations could be recorded, trusted associates could be wearing a wire, and the possibility of indictment was no longer far-fetched theory but an everyday risk. At the same time, cultural shifts in the broader society were reshaping the world the young gangster was moving through. The post-war boom brought televisions into living rooms, highways cut through old neighborhoods, and new suburbs lured some families out of the crowded city. But in many urban enclaves, including large parts of Queens, the old patterns of social hierarchy persisted well into the 1960s. Respect for elders, loyalty to family, and skepticism toward government remained strong values. These could be positive forces, anchoring people through tough times. They could also be harnessed by organized crime figures who cast themselves as protectors of the neighborhood, stepping in where official institutions seemed distant or indifferent. For someone in Asaro's position, that image of the man of respect in the community, someone who could get things done, broker disputes, or provide a loan when a bank would not, was part of the appeal and part of the lure. None of this removes personal responsibility from those who chose crime as a career. Many boys who grew up on those same streets chose other paths entirely: factory work, small business, or higher education. But to understand Vincent Asaro not as a caricature, but as a product of his time and place, it is essential to see the overlapping pressures and incentives at work. He was shaped by an immigrant culture seeking stability, by a neighborhood that sat on the edge of one of the world's busiest airports, and by a criminal organization that had seamlessly woven itself into the fabric of daily life in mid-century New York. As the 1960s advanced, internal tensions within the Bonanno family would erupt into open conflict, leading to power struggles, disappearances, and increased scrutiny from law enforcement. The family's position within the underworld order wobbled, even as its street operations continued. Men at the middle levels of the organization, those who collected money, passed orders, and dealt directly with associates in the neighborhoods, had to navigate a landscape in which both internal rivalries and external pressure from the police and FBI were intensifying. It was in this era that Asaro's name began to appear more frequently in investigative files, tied to individuals and locations already under watch. From the vantage point of later decades, it is tempting to see inevitability in this trajectory, to imagine that the boy from Ozone Park was destined to become the aging defendant in a federal courtroom, his life's choices dissected in front of reporters and jurors. But history is never truly inevitable. It is shaped by choices made in specific circumstances, by opportunities taken and others ignored, by the institutions that fail to intervene early and by those that finally do. Vincent Asaro's early life and the world that formed him were not glamorous. They were a mix of hardship, community, temptation, and a powerful undercurrent of criminal enterprise that offered an alternative vision of success. Those forces would not only shape his destiny, but also help set the stage for some of the most notorious episodes in the story of organized crime in modern New York. By the early 1960s, Vincent Asaro was no longer just the kid from Ozone Park watching older men hold court in storefront social clubs. He was a young adult standing closer to the center of that world, in a neighborhood where everyone seemed to know who was with which group, even if no one said it out loud. The same streets where families pushed strollers and workers grabbed coffee on the way to morning shifts were also the staging ground for a quieter, parallel economy. People in Ozone Park and neighboring Howard Beach learned the rhythms of that life without ever needing a handbook. Who to greet respectfully, which cafes attracted certain crowds, when to look away if something unusual was happening at the curb. Into that everyday landscape, Asaro stepped deeper, his name gradually entering the confidential notes and mental files of detectives and federal agents trying to map the structure of New York's organized crime families. At that time, the Bonanno organization he was linked to had both prestige and problems. Under Joseph Bonanno, the family had been one of the original 5 families, recognized in the underworld after the bloody internal conflicts of the early 1930s. It had strong Sicilian roots and long-standing rackets in Brooklyn and Queens, particularly among immigrants from the same regions of Italy. But by the mid-1960s, the Bonannos were sliding into what came to be known as the Bananas War, a period of internal strife that followed Bonanno's unexplained disappearance in 1964. To law enforcement, it looked like a kidnapping or forced exile engineered by rivals. To many inside the underworld, it confirmed that no, Boss was entirely safe once doubts about his leadership took hold. The conflict that followed trickled down to the streets. Factions formed behind different senior figures, clashes erupted, and the families standing among the other New York organizations faltered. For the rank and file and for up-and-coming figures like Asaro, the turmoil meant more than headlines. It dictated who they answered to, how steady their income was, and whether a misstep in loyalty could suddenly turn lethal. Queens-based crews, somewhat removed from the old Brooklyn and Manhattan strongholds, tried to maintain continuity in their day-to-day money-making operations even as the leadership picture at the top changed and then changed again. The imperative was simple: keep the cash flowing, no matter who was sitting in the boss's chair. In that environment, young men with useful skills and the right connections could advance. Those skills were not academic degrees or resumes in the conventional sense. They were reputational, the ability to keep quiet, to handle pressure without panicking, to collect what was owed without causing unnecessary attention, and to move stolen goods and contraband in and out of warehouses, trucks, and loading docks. Asaro, according to later federal filings and testimony, became known within the Bonanno sphere as someone comfortable around the growing web of rackets tied to the expanding international airport on the edge of his neighborhood. Idlewild Airport, renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport after the president's assassination, had grown into one of the busiest air hubs in the world. That growth meant immense quantities of cargo, much of it valuable, some of it lightly guarded, passing through facilities just a short drive from Ozone Park. The airport quickly became a magnet for organized crime across multiple families. Lucchese connected groups, Gambino-linked stevedores, and Bonanno associates all sought footholds in the unions, trucking companies, and warehouse operations that handled freight. Theft from airport cargo was, by the standards of street crime, relatively low risk and high reward. Packages could be misdirected, inventory quietly adjusted, or entire loads diverted before anyone noticed. Insurance companies and large corporations often absorbed the losses on paper, but behind those abstractions were real costs, higher premiums, increased prices for consumers, and, for lower-level employees who got caught, the ruin of careers and families. While detailed, year-by-year records of Asaro's activities in this period are sparse. The nature of such criminal work was to avoid written documentation. Later indictments cast this era as formative. By the late 1960s, prosecutors would say he was no longer merely an associate hovering around the edges of Bonanno crews, but a trusted figure in a Queens-based contingent that made the airport and surrounding trucking routes a primary source of income. He did not advertise that role. Like many in his position, he adopted what seemed from the outside to be a fairly ordinary life. A house in the neighborhood, family ties, day-to-day routines that did not draw undue attention. To neighbors, he could appear as just another local man rooted in the old community. To investigators trying to piece together the inner workings of the Queens rackets, his name appeared again and again in connection with people they already knew they had to watch. Law enforcement's own methods were changing in these years, often in direct response to the kind of operations that flourished around the airport. Congressional hearings and investigative journalism in the 1950s and early 1960s had pushed the issue of organized crime into the national spotlight, leading to a gradual expansion of federal tools. The Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 gave law enforcement greater authority to use electronic surveillance, with court approval, in organized crime cases. 2 years later, in 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, a sweeping law designed to target the leadership and structure of criminal enterprises, not just their foot soldiers. For someone like Asaro, climbing the internal ladder of a crime family at precisely the moment RICO was created meant that his entire generation of mobsters was operating under rules that had suddenly shifted, whether they realized it or not. From the street-level perspective at the time, however, those legal shifts may have felt distant. What mattered day to day were practical questions: which truck was worth targeting, which bettor was falling behind on payments, which union delegate could be pressured, and which law enforcement officers were susceptible to bribery or, at least, likely to look the other way. In later court proceedings, federal agents and cooperating witnesses described how airport-connected crews broke down the work. Some group members handled intelligence, identifying vulnerable shipments and contacts inside airlines and cargo firms. Others specialized in logistics, arranging trucks, storage, and fences who could resell stolen goods. Still others dealt with enforcement, ensuring that no one in the chain decided to pull away or talk to authorities. It was an informal, constantly shifting division of labor, but it added up to a system that siphoned millions of dollars worth of property each year. The 1960s also brought a harsher climate of suspicion within the underworld itself, particularly around the risk of informants. Appalachian and subsequent investigations had revealed just how damaging insider cooperation could be, and law enforcement made no secret of its efforts to flip lower-level participants. Against that backdrop, any hint that someone was speaking to the police could provoke a drastic response. One of the most serious allegations that would later be leveled against Asaro arose from precisely this atmosphere: the case of a Queens warehouse owner named Paul Katz. Katz was a businessman whose facilities, according to later testimony, were used in the late 1960s by mob-connected figures to store stolen goods. In 2014, nearly half a century after those events, federal prosecutors charged Asaro with participating in Katz's killing in 1969, alleging that Katz was suspected at the time of cooperating with law enforcement about thefts from his warehouse. The core of the prosecution's narrative came from a crucial insider, Gaspar Valenti, a cousin of Asaro's by marriage and a man who had lived for decades inside the Bonanno sphere before becoming a government witness. Valenti's account, delivered on the witness stand in a Brooklyn federal courtroom, painted a picture of a young but already influential Asaro reacting violently to the belief that Katz had become an informant. According to this testimony, Katz was killed, and his remains were hidden in a home in Ozone Park linked to Valenti. Decades later, in 2013, acting on information from Valenti, the FBI excavated the basement of that house and found human remains identified through forensic analysis as Katz's. For prosecutors, the discovery appeared to confirm that part of Valenti's story, and they presented it as one of several predicate acts of violence and racketeering in their case against Asaro. It is important to stress, however, that these remained allegations, not proven facts in the eyes of the law. In 2015, after a high-profile trial that examined not only the Katz case, but also the famous Lufthansa robbery and other claimed crimes, a jury acquitted Asaro on all charges, including those related to Katz. Jurors later told reporters that they found Valenti's testimony inconsistent and were not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. For historians, the episode illustrates both the challenges of reconstructing underworld events decades after they occur and the depth of mistrust and secrecy that characterized the world in which Asaro moved as a younger man. Whether or not one accepts the prosecution's view of the Katz case, it is clear that the fear of informants and the harsh punishments that could follow such suspicions were integral features of his environment. The Katz allegations were only one element of a broader picture that prosecutors and agents would eventually assemble about Asaro's early career. They alleged that by the late 1960s and 1970s, he was deeply involved in the Bonanno family's Queens-based operations, particularly those linked to theft and hijacking. Hijacking in this context did not necessarily mean the cinematic image of masked men leaping into moving trucks, though such events did occur, but rather the systematic diversion of goods in transit. A truck might be loaded with valuable merchandise at a warehouse and never officially arrive at its destination. Its contents would instead be transferred, resold, and laundered through intermediaries. Often, insiders at airlines, shipping companies, and trucking firms played key roles, sometimes willingly and sometimes under pressure. Asaro's alleged expertise, according to later law enforcement characterizations, lay in navigating this intricate ecosystem. He was portrayed as someone with enough standing inside the Bonanno hierarchy to authorize and organize thefts, while also maintaining working arrangements with figures from other families who controlled different parts of the airport underworld. It was in this context that his path intersected, in the government's telling, with James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke, an Irish-American associate of the Lukey's crime family whose name would become indelibly linked with the Lufthansa heist. Burke's crew, which included figures later popularized in books and films about the mob, operated heavily around an Ozone Park bar and hangout called Robert's Lounge. It was a short drive from the streets where Asaro had built his life. Cross-family collaborations were hardly unprecedented. While the mafia's internal rules technically discouraged members from engaging in unsanctioned joint ventures with other families, the practical reality in places like the airport was more fluid. Territory and influence overlapped. A large-scale theft operation might require access to union officials tied to one family, warehouse space under another's influence, and trucking routes quietly controlled by a third. In such scenarios, someone like Asaro, rooted in the Sicilian heavy Bonanno world but geographically embedded in the same Queens neighborhoods as Burke's predominantly Irish crew, was well positioned to act as a bridge, at least as prosecutors would later portray it. Inside the Bonanno family, meanwhile, leadership continued to evolve. After the chaotic years of the Bananas War, Philip Rasselli emerged in the 1970s as a dominant figure, though his rule was complicated by repeated prison terms. Carmine Galante, a ruthless capo with a fearsome reputation, also exerted significant influence and sought to steer the family deeper into narcotics trafficking, particularly heroin. While there is no public record tying Asaro directly to drug operations, the climate of the family during these years was unmistakably shaped by the conflicts and crackdowns surrounding narcotics. Galante's murder in 1979, widely seen as an internal underworld decision to remove a destabilizing figure, underscored how precarious power had become at the top. For middle-ranking figures and ambitious associates, survival meant keeping their heads down when necessary, aligning with whatever faction seemed ascendant, and ensuring that money continued to flow upward from the street. By this period, law enforcement and journalistic accounts increasingly referred to Asaro as a made member of the Bonanno family, indicating that he had gone through the organization's formal initiation, a ceremony that conferred full membership and the protections and obligations that came with it. The internal ritual itself, with its oaths and symbols, has been described in general terms in numerous trials against various families. But in Asaro's specific case, there is no public transcript of his induction. What is known is the end result. He was treated and described by both underworld peers and federal authorities as a full-fledged member, and eventually as a captain, responsible for overseeing a crew. With status came both influence and vulnerability. Captains were expected to manage crews that engaged in an array of money-making schemes, from illegal gambling and loan sharking to stolen goods and extortion. In Queens, where the proximity of JFK made cargo theft particularly attractive, such operations formed a major part of the portfolio. The human cost of these rackets could be easy to overlook from the outside. Loan sharking, for example, often targeted people who had already lost heavily through gambling or who were shut out of legitimate credit. Interest rates could be crushing, and the pressure to pay could spill over into threats and, at times, outright violence. Illegal gambling might be portrayed by participants as a harmless pastime, but the web of debt and dependency it produced fueled other criminal activity and left families scrambling when a main breadwinner was caught in a cycle of losses. Balancing this underworld existence, Asaro maintained a home life in Ozone Park. Later, during his 2015 trial, relatives and friends would describe him in letters to the court as a family man, someone who attended gatherings, cared about his grandchildren, and helped neighbors. Such portraits are not unusual in organized crime cases. Many longtime mob figures have lived double lives in this sense, presenting one face in the domestic sphere and another in the social clubs and back rooms where criminal business was conducted. For historical understanding, the coexistence of these realities is part of what makes figures like Asaro both troubling and compelling. He was not a cloistered mastermind operating from afar, but someone embedded in the fabric of a community, visible at barbecues and block parties even as his name circulated in FBI memoranda. By the mid-1970s, the pieces that would define the most famous chapter of his story were sliding into place. The airport was busier than ever, handling not only passengers, but also vast quantities of international currency and high-value cargo. Security, while gradually improving, still had significant gaps, particularly around the systems by which airlines stored and briefly held cash shipments on their way to central banks. Burke's Lukey's connected crew had built a reputation for daring thefts and tight control over certain airport workers. The Bonanno presence in Queens remained entrenched, with captains like Asaro overseeing crews that knew the terrain and the right people to approach for inside information. At the same time, federal and local authorities were slowly improving their grasp of how these operations worked. Task forces combining FBI agents, Port Authority police, and NYPD detectives traced patterns in cargo theft, noting recurring names and locations. They knew that large scores were being planned and executed. They had informants and wiretaps in some circles but not in others. In this murky landscape of partial visibility, one potential target at the airport stood out above all: the foreign cargo building used by Lufthansa, the West German airline, which regularly held enormous sums of cash flown in for transfer to American banks. By 1978, rumors of that money and the possibility of taking it had been circulating in criminal circles for years. When federal prosecutors finally moved against Asaro decades later, they would center much of their case on what they said happened next: his alleged role in helping to plan and profit from the Lufthansa heist of December 1978. They would present cooperating witnesses, recorded conversations, and forensic evidence in an effort to argue that the man who sat quietly at the defense table in 2015 had, in his 40s, been one of the crucial links between the Bonanno world of Queens and the Lukey's connected crew that pulled off the robbery. The jury would ultimately reject that narrative, acquitting him on all counts. But to understand how he came to be in the crosshairs of such a historic prosecution, one has to see how the preceding decade, shaped by family wars, airport rackets, and the evolution of law enforcement tools, had positioned Vincent Asaro at the crossroads of some of New York's most consequential underworld currents on the eve of the crime that would go down in legend. In the late 1970s, a sense of possibility and danger hung over the streets around John F. Kennedy International Airport. The oil shocks and inflation of the decade had shaken the national economy, but New York's major airport remained a conduit for staggering amounts of money and merchandise. For men embedded in the criminal networks that orbited the cargo buildings and trucking depots, it felt as though every week brought news of another shipment: a crate of electronics, a pallet of furs, a consignment of pharmaceuticals, moving through warehouses secured more by routine than by rigor. Among those who understood this landscape well was Vincent Asaro, by then regarded within law enforcement circles as a made member of the Bonanno crime family, and a man whose influence in Queens extended from Ozone Park toward the airport perimeter. The crime that would launch his name into national headlines decades later did not begin as a cinematic fantasy, but as a series of conversations and calculations among men already accustomed to exploiting gaps in the airport's defenses. Information was currency in that world. An airline employee might mention, over drinks, that a particular carrier held cash in its vaults overnight. A cargo handler could quietly note which loading bays were poorly lit or under-patrolled. In the case of the Lufthansa heist, the key tip is widely believed to have come from inside the airline itself. An employee who knew that enormous sums of foreign currency regularly passed through Lufthansa's cargo facility in Queens on their way from overseas branches of American banks to vaults in Manhattan. By 1978, this insider had reportedly passed word to a bookie with connections in Queens, who in turn relayed the information into the orbit of James, Jimmy the Gent Burke, a Lukey's connected figure operating out of Robert's Lounge, a bar on Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park. Burke was already known among law enforcement for his involvement in hijackings and cargo theft at the airport. His crew included several men who would later be immortalized in popular culture through books and films about the wise guy life. But however colorful their later portrayals, the decisions they made in that period revolved around cold assessments of risk and reward. How much money could be taken, how quickly, and how likely was it that anyone involved would be identified? In subsequent indictments and hearings, federal prosecutors would argue that this is where Vincent Asaro entered the story. They alleged that he, as a Bonanno captain with deep roots in Ozone Park and connections to airport-focused rackets, became a crucial link between Burke's crew and the broader underworld, helping to plan the logistics of the robbery and expecting to share in the proceeds. Their case rested heavily on two sources: the testimony of his distant cousin, Gaspar Valenti, and secretly recorded conversations from the 2000s in which Asaro appeared to reference the crime and complain about the distribution of its profits. He and his attorneys would later insist that these were the boasts and recollections of an older man talking loosely, not admissions of actual involvement. When the matter finally went before a jury in 2015, that jury would side with him, acquitting him on all Lufthansa-related counts. But in reconstructing the story as it was presented, it is necessary to understand that, for law enforcement, the alleged connection between Asaro and Burke's crew was central. What is certain, independent of those later disputes, is that in the early hours of December 11, 1978, a group of armed men entered Lufthansa's cargo building at JFK and carried out one of the largest cash thefts in American history up to that time. The robbers subdued and restrained the employees on duty and made their way to the secure storage area where the airline held cash and valuables that had arrived on a flight from Germany. By the time they left, they had taken roughly $5 million in unmarked U.S. currency and about $875,000 in jewelry, more than $22 million in today's dollars when adjusted for inflation. The operation was swift and ruthlessly efficient. No shots were fired, and no one was killed during the robbery itself, but the psychological shock to the workers involved and to the airline industry as a whole was profound. News of the heist spread quickly. Morning headlines blared the story of the audacious robbery at JFK, and commentators marveled at how such a large sum could have been stored in one place under protections that, in retrospect, seemed inadequate. For many Americans, the Lufthansa heist became a symbol of a broader sense that institutions were vulnerable, that sophisticated criminals could outmaneuver corporate security and law enforcement alike. For investigators in New York, however, the robbery was not an abstract parable but an urgent crisis. The FBI, the Port Authority Police, and the NYPD launched a massive joint investigation, interviewing airline employees, reviewing logs, and trying to trace any unusual movements of cargo and vehicles in and out of the airport that night. From the outset, detectives suspected that the crime had required help from inside Lufthansa or its contractors. The robbers had known exactly where to go and when to strike. Attention quickly focused on certain employees with gambling debts or known associations with underworld figures. Within weeks, that focus would contribute to the arrest of a Lufthansa employee named Louis Werner, who was eventually convicted in 1979 for his role in providing inside information. But even as Werner went to prison, the core question, who had orchestrated and carried out the robbery, remained officially unresolved. Law enforcement privately pointed to Burke and his Lukey's-connected associates as prime suspects, but building a case that could stand up in court, especially one that would reach beyond the immediate gunmen to higher-ups and associates, proved difficult. In the neighborhoods around Ozone Park and Howard Beach, word of the heist traveled along more informal channels. Residents who had long heard stories of scores at the airport now whispered about a robbery so big that it seemed to dwarf everything before it. The sudden appearance of expensive cars, lavish spending in certain bars, and debts paid off overnight did not go unnoticed. Yet in communities where loyalty and silence were deeply ingrained values, such changes were treated cautiously, as signs that something significant had happened, but not something to be spoken about openly. For men like Asaro, whether or not they were actually involved, the robbery's aftermath illustrated the double-edged nature of spectacular crimes. They generated immense profits, but also intense scrutiny. That scrutiny was not limited to the Lufthansa case. The late 1970s and early 1980s marked a turning point in how federal authorities approached organized crime in New York. The passage of the RICO statute in 1970 had given prosecutors powerful new tools, but it took years for them to fully develop strategies for using those tools effectively. By the time of the Lufthansa heist, FBI agents were increasingly focused on penetrating the top leadership of the city's crime families, rather than simply sweeping up lower-level participants. Long-term undercover operations, the cultivation of high-level cooperators, and extensive electronic surveillance all became central components in this new approach. Nowhere was this evolution more dramatic than in the case of the Bonanno family itself. In 1976, an FBI agent named Joseph Pistone began an undercover mission infiltrating the organization under the alias Donnie Brasco, posing as a jewel thief and small-time burglar. Over 6 years, he gained the trust of members of a Brooklyn-based Bonanno crew, attending meetings, helping with minor crimes, and gradually working his way closer to the family's inner circle. His work would eventually expose enormous detail about the family's operations, internal politics, and connections to other crime groups. When the operation was finally shut down in 1981, for fear that Pistone's cover was in danger, the fallout inside the Bonanno world was catastrophic. Several members were killed in retribution for having allowed an undercover agent into their confidence, and the family's status within the broader mafia landscape suffered severely. The other New York families reportedly expelled the Bonannos from the commission, the informal governing council of bosses. For someone like Asaro, operating in Queens during this period, the Donnie Brasco affair underscored the growing risks of law enforcement penetration. Even if he had never met Pistone himself, the agent's primary work had been in Brooklyn. The message was unmistakable. The old assumption that nobody can touch us was no longer tenable. Trust, always a scarce commodity in the underworld, became even more tightly rationed. New faces were regarded with suspicion, and conversations that might once have taken place in crowded social clubs shifted to more private settings as members tried to reduce the risk of bugs and informants. The Lufthansa case itself, even as it remained officially unsolved, intersected with this broader climate of fear. Over the years following the robbery, a series of violent deaths and disappearances befell individuals rumored to have been involved, particularly those connected to Burke's crew. One by one, men vanished or were found dead under circumstances that strongly suggested internal settling of accounts. Attempts, in the eyes of investigators, to reduce the number of people who knew exactly what had happened that night at the Lufthansa cargo building. These killings, while never linked to Asaro in any court of law, reinforced the aura of danger surrounding the heist and made potential witnesses even more reluctant to come forward. For the communities of Queens and Brooklyn, these events were disturbing in a more diffuse way. Residents might not know the specifics of who was being targeted or why, but they saw the pattern. People associated with certain bars, certain social clubs, certain reputations turning up missing or dead. It contributed to a sense that alongside the ordinary rhythms of urban life, a child's walk to school, a shopkeeper opening his shutters each morning, there existed another rhythm of clandestine meetings, unreported violence, and sudden disappearances. Ordinary people could go about their days without ever encountering that hidden world directly, but they understood that it existed nearby. Against this backdrop, Vincent Asaro managed something that many in his line of work could not. He remained largely invisible to the general public. His name did not appear on the front pages of newspapers in the 1980s the way some other mob figures' names did. He was not swept up in the era's most high-profile RICO trials, such as the famous commission case of 1985-86 that targeted the leadership of 4 of the 5 families. Nor was he one of the Bonanno members indicted in the immediate aftermath of the Donnie Brasco revelations. Instead, he stayed where he had long been, rooted in Queens, connected to Ozone Park and Howard Beach, operating in areas where the overlap between legitimate businesses and criminal rackets was dense and complicated. Inside law enforcement, however, he was not forgotten. Internal FBI reports and New York Police Department intelligence files from the 1980s and 1990s identified him as a Bonanno member, and eventually as a captain overseeing a crew in Queens. Investigators linked his name to traditional rackets that remained staples of the family's income: illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, and schemes involving stolen property. The exact scope of his activities is difficult to map with precision. By design, such operations left minimal paper trails, and witnesses who might have clarified details often had strong incentives to remain silent. But the steady repetition of his name in confidential documents over the years reflected a consistent assessment. He was a long-term player, not a transient or peripheral figure. The 1980s were not kind to the Bonanno family as an institution. In addition to the embarrassment and structural damage caused by the Donnie Brasco infiltration, the family faced repeated prosecutions and internal power struggles. Philip Rasselli, the longtime boss, spent much of his later life in and out of prison, hampering his ability to maintain firm control. Various factions contested for influence, sometimes aligning with or against emerging power brokers like Joseph Massino, a Queens-based figure who would eventually be recognized as boss in the 1990s. Through all this, the core business of the family did not stop. Crews continued to collect gambling revenues, extend high-interest loans to desperate borrowers, skim from construction projects, and exploit their connections in unions and businesses. The leadership might change, but the expectations placed on captains and soldiers remained constant: deliver money upward, maintain discipline, and avoid bringing unnecessary heat. Life in Queens reflected the contradictions of this era. Ozone Park and Howard Beach, once on the outskirts of urban development, had become well-established neighborhoods with tidy lawns, small brick houses, and a mix of working-class and lower-middle-class residents. Many families there had little or nothing to do with organized crime. They worked regular jobs, worried about schools and property taxes, and watched their children grow up in a city still struggling with high crime rates and fiscal challenges. At the same time, mob-connected social clubs, bars, and businesses remained fixtures in certain pockets. A man like Asaro could, on the same day, attend a family gathering or a church function, and then step into a back room where bets were being tallied, payments counted, and quiet instructions relayed. That dual existence is central to understanding his trajectory. His later supporters, writing letters to the court during his 2015 trial, described acts of kindness and generosity, helping neighbors in need, offering support to relatives during difficult times, maintaining close bonds with his children and grandchildren. Prosecutors, for their part, highlighted a very different pattern: decades of involvement in conspiracies that harmed both direct victims and the broader community. Neither portrait is complete on its own. Taken together, they reveal a man whose life bridged the worlds of family and crime in ways that challenge simplistic narratives of good and bad. Meanwhile, the legend of the Lufthansa heist took on a life of its own in the broader culture. Journalists returned to the case periodically, especially when new informants came forward or when another suspected participant met a violent end. In 1990, the film Goodfellas, based on the life of former Lukey's associate Henry Hill, brought the robbery to an even wider audience. The movie's depiction of the planning and aftermath of the heist, though dramatized for storytelling purposes, cemented its status as one of the most famous crimes in American popular memory. For viewers, the story often seemed to center on colorful personalities and audacious acts. For law enforcement veterans and families of those who had been killed in related violence, it was a reminder of unfinished business and unresolved pain. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, federal and state authorities continued to chip away at the Bonanno family. A series of prosecutions targeted both street-level operations and leadership. Most devastating of all was the eventual cooperation of boss Joseph Massino himself, who, facing the possibility of the death penalty for a string of murders and racketeering charges, chose in 2003 to become the first sitting boss of a New York crime family to turn government witness. His decision to testify against former associates and provide detailed information about the family's inner workings stunned the underworld and gave prosecutors a trove of intelligence about Bonanno structure and history. Yet through all of these waves of law enforcement success, one name remained conspicuously absent from the list of high-profile defendants: Vincent Asaro. Even as colleagues and rivals were indicted, convicted, or flipped to the government, he remained in the background, mentioned in court papers and law enforcement charts, but not himself the target of a major federal case. For investigators who believed he had played a role in significant crimes, including Lufthansa, this absence was a source of frustration. For Asaro, it meant that, well into his 60s and 70s, he could continue to walk the same neighborhood streets where his criminal life had begun, a living link between the old days of airport hijackings and the modern, RICO-dominated era. It would not last forever. In the early 2010s, a convergence of factors, new cooperating witnesses, fresh analysis of old evidence, and the willingness of federal prosecutors to revisit files set the stage for a dramatic shift in his fortunes. The Lufthansa case, which had lingered officially unsolved for more than 3 decades, would suddenly re-emerge as a live legal issue. The man who had spent a lifetime avoiding the full spotlight of a federal trial would find himself at the center of one of the most heavily publicized organized crime prosecutions of the new century. His past laid out in detail before a judge, a jury, and a nationwide audience being asked to decide whether the stories told about him were finally to be believed. When federal agents in New York began quietly revisiting the Lufthansa file in the early 2010s, it did not look at first like the beginning of a case that would upend the life of an aging mob figure in Queens. Cold cases were periodically reviewed, particularly those that had left a mark on public memory. The Lufthansa heist was one of those. Its sheer scale, its audacity, and the long trail of violence that followed had ensured that it was never entirely forgotten inside the FBI's New York field office. Even so, decades had passed. Many of the suspected participants were dead. Memories had faded. Physical evidence was scarce. What made this review different was not a new fingerprint or a missing file suddenly found, but a person. A man who had lived for years on the margins of the Bonanno world and who, under pressure of his own, had decided to talk. Gaspar Gary Valenti was not an outsider to Vincent Asaro's life. He was related by marriage, part of the extended network of kin and neighbors that bound together so many in Ozone Park. He had grown up in the same cultural world, done small jobs for the same kinds of people, absorbed the same lessons about loyalty and silence. By the mid-2000s, however, Valenti's circumstances were deteriorating. He was aging. Money was tight. He carried his own criminal history and, according to later court testimony, found himself increasingly worried about what might happen if law enforcement decided to hold him fully accountable. In 2008, facing that crossroads, he made a choice that would alter not only his own trajectory, but Asaro's as well. He agreed to cooperate with the FBI. The details of how that cooperation began emerged during Asaro's 2015 trial. Valenti testified that he had first approached law enforcement through an intermediary, then met with agents and prosecutors to discuss what he knew. In exchange for financial support and protection, and in the hope of avoiding prosecution for his own crimes, he signed on as a confidential informant. Over the next several years, he wore a recording device during conversations with Asaro and other men in their circle, capturing hours of dialogue that agents would later painstakingly transcribe and analyze. To the public, these meetings looked like nothing more than older relatives and friends passing time together, reminiscing about the past. To investigators listening through headphones in anonymous offices, they were a rare window into decades of underworld history. The recordings were not a neat narrative. They were fragments, complaints about how money had been divided, half-finished anecdotes about scores long past, offhand references to people known only by nicknames. Agents compared these fragments with old investigative files, newspaper clippings, and testimony from other cooperators, searching for overlaps. Again and again, they found themselves circling back to two clusters of events: the 1969 disappearance of a Queens warehouse owner named Paul Katz and the 1978 Lufthansa heist. In both, Asaro's name had floated in law enforcement rumor for years without ever anchoring to evidence strong enough to bring into court. Now, in Valenti's recordings and debriefings, those rumors took on new, more concrete shapes. One of the most consequential developments grew out of the Katz case. As noted earlier, Katz's remains would ultimately be discovered in the basement of a house in Ozone Park, where Valenti had once lived, after he led agents there in 2013. The find made national news: human bones dug out from under a suburban home, linked by forensic testing to a man who had vanished more than 40 years earlier. For prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York, it was a powerful piece of physical evidence to pair with Valenti's narrative, which described Katz as a warehouse owner suspected of talking to police about thefts and thereby, in the underworld's eyes, forfeiting his right to mercy. The Lufthansa element of Valenti's cooperation was less about physical evidence. None had ever been found tying Asaro or anyone else directly to the cargo building that night, and more about his recounting of conversations and supposed planning meetings. According to his later testimony, he claimed that Asaro spoke of being involved in the preparations for the heist and of feeling cheated in how the proceeds were distributed afterward. On the recordings, Asaro could be heard lamenting that we never got our share from the robbery and expressing bitterness about the way Burke and others had handled the money. To agents, these did not sound like a man simply repeating what he had heard from others. They sounded like someone talking about his own experience. There is, of course, an important distinction between what law enforcement believes and what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. That distinction would define what came next. As investigators compiled their files and prosecutors debated strategy, one thing became clear. If they moved forward with a major case against Asaro, it would rest heavily on the credibility of Valenti and on the jury's interpretation of those recorded conversations. There was no DNA from the Lufthansa crime scene, no clear eyewitness willing to take the stand and point at Asaro as one of the masked men. The case would be a test not only of one man's guilt or innocence, but of how far RICO and informant-driven prosecutions could stretch into the past. In January 2014, after months of work assembling evidence and drafting legal filings, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York unsealed an indictment charging Vincent Asaro and several other alleged Bonanno figures in a sweeping racketeering conspiracy. The document alleged a criminal career spanning from the late 1960s into the 2010s, with predicate acts that included the Katz killing, the Lufthansa robbery, armed robbery of a jewelry store, extortion, and other offenses. The centerpiece, at least in the eyes of reporters and the public, was unmistakable. For the first time, a man was being formally accused in federal court of participating in the legendary Lufthansa heist. The arrest operation unfolded in the familiar pre-dawn choreography of modern law enforcement. On a cold January morning, agents descended on homes in Queens and elsewhere, knocking loudly, announcing themselves, and taking suspects into custody. At Asaro's residence in Ozone Park, they found a 70-something man whose appearance, white hair, heavy glasses, the bearing of an old neighborhood grandfather, contrasted sharply with the image of the daring airport hijacker that the indictment conjured. Cameras were waiting outside the courthouse later that day as he was led in, flanked by marshals, the press shouting questions about Lufthansa and the bones in the basement. At the arraignment, prosecutors painted a portrait of a lifelong mobster finally being brought to book. They argued that the crimes alleged were serious enough, and the risk of flight and danger to the community great enough, to justify keeping him in custody. Defense attorneys countered that their client was an elderly man in declining health, rooted in his community, and that the government's case rested on the unreliable word of a paid informant and decades-old hearsay. The judge ultimately allowed Asaro to be released on a multi-million-dollar bond, secured by property and co-signers, under house arrest with electronic monitoring. He returned to his Ozone Park home, but his world had changed. Federal restrictions and looming trial dates replaced the relative anonymity he had managed to maintain for so long. In the months that followed, lawyers on both sides filed motions, challenged aspects of the indictment, and negotiated over what evidence would be admissible at trial. Defense counsel sought to exclude or limit certain recordings, argued that the time gap between the alleged crimes and the indictment prejudiced their ability to mount an effective defense, and attacked Valenti's credibility in pretrial filings. The prosecution, for its part, emphasized the seriousness of the alleged racketeering enterprise and the corroborative value of the physical evidence in the Katz case. Any thought of a negotiated plea quietly receded. By all available accounts, Asaro was determined to go to trial and fight the charges, despite the risks. When the trial finally began in the fall of 2015 in a Brooklyn federal courtroom, it drew significant media attention. Reporters filled the gallery, joining court watchers and family members from both sides. The government's opening statement laid out a dramatic arc. A young man drawn into the Bonanno family, climbing its ranks, orchestrating thefts and violence over decades, helping plot one of the most famous robberies in American history, and evading accountability until modern investigative tools and a cooperating insider finally caught up with him. They described Lufthansa as the crown jewel in a career of crime, and pointed to the bones of Paul Katz as silent witnesses to the brutality used to protect that world. The defense, in turn, urged jurors to focus on the quality of the evidence, not the sensational nature of the allegations. They reminded the panel that the Lufthansa heist, for all its notoriety, had become the subject of books and movies, a story that could easily bleed into myth and assumption. They argued that the government, under pressure to produce a culprit after 37 years, had built a case on the shaky foundation of a single cooperating witness, Valenti, who had every incentive to embellish or fabricate, and whose memory of supposed conversations from decades earlier was impossible to verify. As for the recorded snippets of Asaro complaining about money from the heist, they suggested that these were nothing more than an old man repeating underworld lore, talking big, and seeking status in front of someone he believed to be a loyal relative. Over the next several weeks, the jury heard from a parade of witnesses. Some were law enforcement officers, describing the long history of the Lufthansa investigation and the technical details of wiretaps, surveillance, and forensic testing of the remains found in the Ozone Park basement. Former Lufthansa employees recounted, in careful but restrained terms, the terror they felt that December night in 1978 when masked men burst into the cargo building and forced them to the floor. They did not identify Asaro. None could see the robbers' faces. Their testimony served to ground the case in the reality of the crime's impact rather than its later pop culture depictions. But the heart of the prosecution's case lay with Gaspar Valenti. When he took the stand, he appeared as a man of late middle age, wearing prison attire, speaking in a matter-of-fact tone about a lifetime skirting the edges of the Bonanno world. Over several days, he described his relationship with Asaro, the favors he claimed to have done, the meetings he said he had attended, and the conversations in which, according to him, Asaro discussed both the cat's killing and the Lufthansa planning. He acknowledged his own crimes and his decision to cooperate with the government, explaining that he had done so in part out of fear of his own legal exposure, and in part because he was weary of the life he had lived. On direct examination by prosecutors, Valenti's narrative seemed cohesive. He linked events, named names, and anchored them to approximate dates. But on cross-examination, defense attorneys subjected every inconsistency, every gap in his memory, to intense scrutiny. They highlighted the payments he had received from the government as an informant, monthly stipends and other support that, over time, amounted to a significant sum. They pointed out instances where his statements appeared to change between early debriefings and later court testimony. They forced him to admit that, for decades, he had lied to law enforcement and others about his own activities, raising the question of why he should be believed now. The defense also capitalized on what was not in the record. One of the most famous chroniclers of the Lufthansa heist, former Lukey's associate Henry Hill, had spent years after his own arrest in 1980 providing detailed information to the FBI and journalists about Burke's crew, the robbery, and the violent aftermath. Nowhere in Hill's extensive accounts, memorialized in books, articles, and recorded interviews, did the name Vincent Asaro appear in connection with Lufthansa. Defense lawyers underscored this omission, arguing that if Asaro had truly been a key participant, it was implausible that Hill, who had named so many others, would simply have left him out. For the Katz murder allegations, the prosecution leaned heavily on the discovery of Katz's remains in the house where Valenti had once lived. The bones, identified through DNA and dental records, provided powerful confirmation that Katz had indeed met a violent end, and that Valenti's broad account of a body being hidden in that basement was at least partially accurate. But tying Asaro directly to the killing depended again on Valenti's word. No forensic trace linked Asaro to the scene. No third witness testified to having seen Asaro harm Katz. Defense counsel urged jurors to separate the horror of Katz's fate, on which everyone agreed, from the specific question of whether the government had proven that Asaro had ordered or carried out the killing. Throughout the trial, Asaro sat at the defense table in a suit and tie, listening through a headset when portions of audio evidence were played. Reporters noted his outward calm and the occasional small smile or shake of the head as former associates spoke about him. He did not take the stand in his own defense. His lawyers evidently calculated that the risks of cross-examination outweighed any potential benefit of his personal denial. Instead, they relied on their attacks on Valenti's credibility, their highlighting of gaps in the government's case, and a handful of character witnesses who described the defendant as a devoted family man in his later years. As the case moved to closing arguments, the competing narratives hardened. Prosecutors framed Asaro as a man who had dedicated his life to a criminal enterprise, profited from fear and theft, and thought he had escaped accountability simply because so much time had passed. They urged the jurors not to be swayed by his age or the everyday normalcy of his appearance. The defense, meanwhile, warned against what they characterized as storytelling by the government, an attempt to fit their client into the role of the long-sought Lufthansa mastermind without sufficient proof. They reminded jurors of the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt and suggested that reasonable doubt was exactly what this case produced. The jury began deliberations in November 2015. For 2 days, they reviewed evidence, listened again to key audio clips, and sent questions to the judge. Outside the courthouse, reporters and camera crews waited, conscious that whatever the verdict, It would mark a significant moment in the long saga of the Lufthansa heist. When the jurors finally filed back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Asaro stood, flanked by his attorneys, as the foreperson read out the decisions. Not guilty on charges related to the Lufthansa robbery. Not guilty on charges related to the cat's murder. Not guilty on the remaining racketeering counts. The acquittal reverberated instantly. For Asaro and his family, it was a moment of immense relief. Leaving the courthouse, he told reporters in essence that he was grateful to the jury and had maintained all along that he was innocent of the charges. His defense attorneys declared the case a vindication, criticizing the government for relying so heavily on a paid informant. For the prosecutors and agents who had invested years in building the case, the verdict was a bitter disappointment. The U.S. Attorney's Office issued a statement expressing respect for the jury's decision, while reaffirming its belief in the strength of the evidence it had presented. For the broader public, the result meant that, technically, the Lufthansa heist remained officially unsolved as to who exactly had entered the cargo building and who had orchestrated the crime. Many in law enforcement continued to believe that their long-held suspicions about Burke, his associates, and men like Asaro were essentially correct. But in the American legal system, belief is not enough. Without a conviction, Asaro walked out of court a free man, at least on those charges, and the government's best chance at securing a Lufthansa-related conviction had slipped away. Yet the trial had lasting consequences beyond the verdict. It had brought into the open a wealth of information about Asaro's life and about the inner workings of the Bonanno family in Queens. It had confirmed the enduring willingness of some longtime associates, like Valenti, to cooperate with authorities despite deep cultural prohibitions against doing so. It had shown that even in their 70s and 80s, men who had spent their youths in the underworld were not beyond the reach of federal investigation. And for Asaro himself, it marked a turning point. He had survived a high-stakes RICO prosecution and walked free, something few of his contemporaries had managed. But the trial also cemented his public association with organized crime and with Lufthansa, regardless of the acquittal. In the years that followed, that public image would collide with new legal troubles. Old habits and a lifelong adherence to a certain code of behavior did not disappear simply because a jury had said not guilty. Incidents that might once have been handled quietly within a neighborhood now attracted the close attention of prosecutors sensitized by decades of mob cases. Before long, an episode of anger and retaliation on a Queens street, far smaller in scale than any airport robbery, but telling in its own way, would pull Vincent Asaro back into federal court, this time with very different results. Freedom, after the 2015 acquittal, might have looked from the outside like the closing chapter of Vincent Asaro's long entanglement with the law. He left the courthouse in Brooklyn that November a man vindicated in the narrow legal sense. A jury had said that the government had not proved he was guilty of the Lufthansa heist, the Paul Katz killing, or the racketeering scheme alleged. Back in Ozone Park, neighbors saw him return to the same modest streets where his story had begun decades earlier. Friends and relatives celebrated. Some in the old underworld circles quietly treated the verdict as a triumph of the code of silence and an affirmation that, even in the age of RICO and wiretaps, a lifelong man of respect could beat the government. Inside the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, the mood was very different. Agents and prosecutors who had spent years cultivating witnesses, poring over tapes, and reconstructing events from the 1960s and 1970s were left with the bitter reality that, in the courtroom that mattered, they had lost. The Lufthansa case, for all its investigative effort, remained officially unsolved. Yet their view of Asaro did not change with the verdict. To them, he remained what they had believed all along, a veteran Bonanno captain who had simply slipped the noose. They did not have another Lufthansa-sized case ready to file, but there was never any illusion that he would vanish from their radar. In the months after the trial, Asaro tried to settle into a quieter routine. Now in his late 70s, he was not the brash young man who had once, according to government portrayal, moved confidently through the airport rackets. He spent time with family, appeared at neighborhood gatherings, and walked the same sidewalks where, for generations, people had known his name. Reporters occasionally spotted him and tried to draw comments about the trial and his life in the Bonanno orbit, but he generally kept his public remarks brief, insisting that he had been unfairly targeted and was glad to have cleared his name. For a man who had spent most of his adult life in the shadows of organized crime, the sudden notoriety of being the Lufthansa defendant was not necessarily welcome. Still, habits and attitudes formed over half a century did not simply disappear. The culture in which he had come of age placed immense weight on respect and on swift responses to perceived slights. The same instincts that had made men in his world react strongly to challenges in a social club or on a street corner could, in a different era, come out in situations that most modern New Yorkers would shrug off or treat as unfortunate but routine. That gap between ordinary urban life and the old underworld code would soon have dramatic consequences. Years before the Lufthansa indictment was ever unsealed, an incident had unfolded on the roads of Queens that, at the time, barely registered outside the immediate neighborhood. In April 2012, according to later court documents, Asaro was driving in or near Howard Beach when another motorist in a Jaguar cut him off in traffic. The encounter might have been a simple misunderstanding, an aggressive lane change in congested streets, or a moment of thoughtless impatience, any of the countless minor conflicts that play out daily on city roads. For most drivers, such an episode ends with a honk of the horn, a muttered curse, and a decision to move on. According to the federal indictment filed years later, that was not how Asaro handled it. Investigators would later allege that he took the other driver's maneuver as a personal insult. Rather than letting it go, he followed the vehicle long enough to note its license plate number. Back in his neighborhood, the government claimed. He complained about the incident to younger associates from the Bonanno orbit, expressing anger at the perceived disrespect. Among those alleged to have heard his story was John J. Gotti, the grandson and namesake of the late Gambino boss John Gotti, who, despite his youth, had grown up in the long, complicated shadow of his grandfather's name. What happened next, according to prosecutors, was a small-scale but disturbing echo of older patterns of mob retaliation. Using the license plate information, younger men linked to Asaro located the Jaguar outside the driver's home in Howard Beach. In the early morning hours, they poured gasoline on and around the car and set it on fire. Flames engulfed the vehicle and damaged the front of the house. Neighbors awoke to the crackle of burning metal and the shouts of emergency responders. Firefighters arrived quickly and prevented the blaze from consuming the home, and remarkably, no one was physically injured. To the residents on that block, it appeared as a frightening, senseless act of destruction. One more reminder that unseen grudges could sometimes erupt into danger right on an otherwise quiet street. At the time, the arson did not lead to immediate federal charges against any mob figure. The NYPD and FDNY investigated, and the incident was noted in local reports, but no one was arrested. It was only later, as federal authorities deepened their efforts against remaining Bonanno structures and revisited open-ended files, that the pieces began to come together. Cooperating witnesses, including people in the orbit of both the Bonanno and Gambino families, began to talk about the Jaguar fire as something more than random vandalism. In their accounts, it was described as a favor done for an elder, a way for younger associates to demonstrate loyalty by avenging a trivial slight with disproportionate force. For law enforcement, the story was striking not because the crime itself matched the scale of Lufthansa or decades-old murders, but because of what it suggested about continuity. Even after a highly publicized trial and acquittal, even after reaching an age when most people focus on retirement and grandchildren. A veteran mob figure was allegedly still using his influence to command acts of intimidation and destruction. It suggested, in their view, that his fundamental approach to conflict had not changed. On March 22, 2017, just over a year after his Lufthansa acquittal, federal agents again came to Asaro's door. This time, the charges had nothing to do with airport robberies or long-ago skeletons in basements. A new indictment from the Eastern District of New York accused him of ordering the 2012 car arson in retaliation for the traffic incident. The case also named several co-defendants, including John J. Gotti and other younger men, on related charges tied to the planning and execution of the fire. Prosecutors described the episode as road rage, mob style, a phrase that landed heavily in headlines and underscored how far removed the alleged behavior was from romanticized images of honor among thieves. At his arraignment in Brooklyn, Asaro, now around 80 years old, appeared more frail than he had during the Lufthansa trial, but he pleaded not guilty. His attorneys again pointed to his age and health, framing the new prosecution as an overreach driven by lingering resentment over the earlier acquittal. Yet the evidence in this case was of a different kind. Instead of decades-old memories, the government had cell site data, phone records, and cooperating witnesses tied to a discrete event in 2012. They alleged that Asaro had complained about being cut off, asked allies to find and take care of the car, and later expressed satisfaction when told it had been burned. As the case progressed, the risk calculus shifted. Unlike in the Lufthansa prosecution, where the government had chosen to bring a sweeping racketeering indictment covering multiple alleged crimes over 40 years, the arson case was narrowly focused. The incident had occurred relatively recently. Some of the alleged accomplices were young and under their own legal pressures. The potential sentence, while not on the scale of a life term for murder and long-term racketeering, was still substantial. For an 80-year-old man, even a decade in federal prison could easily mean spending the rest of his life behind bars. In June 2017, in a marked contrast with his defiant stance in the Lufthansa case, Asaro stood before a different Brooklyn federal judge and changed his plea. He admitted his role in the arson conspiracy, acknowledging that he had directed others to set fire to the car as retaliation for the driver's conduct. The plea did not require him to cooperate against others or testify. It was a straightforward admission of guilt in exchange for the dismissal of some additional counts and the avoidance of the uncertainties of trial. In legal terms, he allocuted. He confirmed under oath the basic facts that satisfied the elements of the crime. For a man who had long embraced the mafia's culture of never admitting wrongdoing, even in the face of conviction, this moment represented a significant step. The plea left one major question for the judge to resolve: what sentence to impose? Federal sentencing guidelines offered a range, taking into account the seriousness of the offense, Asaro's criminal history, and his acceptance of responsibility. Prosecutors argued for a significant term, stressing that the arson was not an isolated lapse, but part of a lifelong pattern of using fear and property destruction to settle grievances. They reminded the court that the fire had been set outside a family's home in the early morning hours, creating a serious risk of injury or death to anyone inside. Defense lawyers, on the other hand, emphasized his age and declining health. They noted that he had already endured years of pretrial detention and restrictions, that he had been acquitted on the most serious charges of his career, and that sending an 80-year-old man to prison for a lengthy term was, in effect, a slow death sentence. They described him as a grandfather whose remaining years should be spent with family, not behind bars. Letters from relatives and friends, similar in tone to those submitted before his Lufthansa sentencing, attested again to his loyalty and kindness in private life. At the sentencing hearing, held in late 2017, the judge sought to balance these competing perspectives. She acknowledged his age and health issues, but she did not accept the idea that they should shield him from accountability. Instead, she pointed explicitly to the timeline. Within a few years of being charged in the Lufthansa case, and even before his 2015 acquittal, he had, according to his own plea, ordered a dangerous act of retaliation over a trivial incident in traffic. That pattern, in the court's view, demonstrated that neither age nor prior brushes with the law had deterred him from resorting to criminal behavior. The judge ultimately imposed an 8-year federal prison sentence, along with a term of supervised release to follow and financial penalties. In announcing the sentence, she made clear that the punishment reflected not only the property damage inflicted, but the risk to human life and the broader need to deter others from using violence or arson as a means of resolving everyday disputes. For the first time in his long career, Asaro faced a substantial, uncontested prison term as an elderly man. He was transferred into the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons and eventually assigned to a federal medical center equipped to handle inmates with complex health needs. Behind the walls and razor wire, his world narrowed to the routines of institutional life: counts, meals, medications, limited visits, and slow days in common areas shared with other older or infirm prisoners. Unlike many of the men around him, he carried into that setting a public label. Guards and fellow inmates alike knew his name from news reports: the Lufthansa guy, the Bonanno capo who had beaten one set of charges only to fall on another. But in the regimented environment of a prison medical facility, status from the outside world meant less. Aches, illnesses, and the daily negotiations of confinement weighed more heavily. By 2019 and early 2020, reports from court filings and family statements indicated that his health had worsened. He had suffered at least one stroke, according to submissions by his attorneys, and dealt with heart problems and other age-related conditions. Meanwhile, a new threat emerged, one that no judge or prosecutor in his earlier trials had contemplated: a global pandemic. When COVID-19 swept through the United States in 2020, prisons and jails became particularly vulnerable sites. Crowded conditions, shared facilities, and limited access to advanced medical care made outbreaks difficult to control. News stories and official reports described rapid spreads of the virus in multiple federal institutions, with older and medically compromised inmates at especially high risk. The federal system had long allowed for compassionate release in extraordinary circumstances, permitting judges to reduce sentences when serious medical conditions or other factors made continued incarceration unjust or excessively harsh. Historically, such motions were rarely granted and were almost always initiated by the Bureau of Prisons itself. But changes in federal law, including the First Step Act of 2018, gave inmates and their lawyers a greater ability to bring these requests directly to the courts. As the pandemic deepened, judges around the country faced a wave of petitions from prisoners arguing that their age and health put them in grave danger if they remained behind bars. Asaro's defense team filed such a motion in early 2020, citing his advanced age, now in his early 80s, his documented medical issues, and the conditions at the Federal Medical Center where he was held. They did not deny the seriousness of his crime. He had already admitted guilt. Instead, they argued that the balance between punishment and humanity had shifted under the unprecedented threat of COVID-19. Keeping an elderly, ailing man locked in a facility where the virus was present, they contended, was tantamount to imposing a significantly harsher sentence than the court had intended in 2017. Prosecutors opposed the motion, pointing again to his criminal history and to the potential risk to the community if he were released. They noted that he had ordered the arson while already an older man, suggesting that age alone did not guarantee law-abiding behavior. They also raised concerns about fairness. Many defendants with far less extensive criminal records remained incarcerated, yet did not receive the same level of advocacy or public attention. The judge, confronted with the motion, weighed these arguments against the rapidly evolving public health reality. In April 2020, as COVID-19 case counts climbed and anxiety about prison outbreaks intensified, she issued an order granting compassionate release. In her written decision, she acknowledged the gravity of his offense and his lifelong involvement with organized crime, but found that his age, serious health problems, and the specific risks posed by the pandemic constituted extraordinary and compelling reasons under the law. The remaining term of his sentence would be converted to time on supervised release, meaning he would be confined to his home under strict conditions, subject to monitoring and potential re-incarceration if he violated the court's orders. When he left federal custody and returned once more to Queens, the world he re-entered was drastically different from the one he had known even a few years earlier. The city was under lockdown orders. Streets were unusually quiet. Masks covered the faces of pedestrians. Many of the social clubs and bars that had once served as informal headquarters for mob crews were shuttered, some permanently, as economic pressures compounded the health crisis. For an 80-something former captain of a battered crime family, homecoming in the age of COVID-19 was a subdued affair. Public reaction to his release was mixed. Some commentators criticized the decision, focusing on his criminal past and arguing that compassion should first be extended to non-violent offenders and those serving draconian sentences for drug crimes. Others accepted the ruling as a reasonable application of the law in unprecedented circumstances, noting that he would still be under supervision and that his capacity to orchestrate serious crimes at that age and in that health was limited. For those who had followed his story over the decades, from the rise of airport hijackings to the long shadow of Lufthansa, the image of Vincent Asaro leaving a prison medical facility because a virus posed a greater danger to him than the state did held a certain symbolic weight. His later years, lived largely out of the public spotlight, reflected the final turn in a life that had tracked the broader arc of traditional American organized crime. He had been shaped by the post-war world of Queens rackets, reached his peak influence at a time when Cosa Nostra families still held significant sway over unions and industries, and then watched as RICO prosecutions, informant culture, and demographic changes eroded that old order. The 2015 Lufthansa trial and the 2017 arson case brought him briefly into national view. But what lay behind those headlines was a longer story about how individuals, communities, and institutions intersected in the shadowed spaces where law and loyalty collided. In the constrained quiet of home confinement, under the conditions laid down by the court, there was no going back to the world that had once defined him. Law enforcement's decades-long campaign against the five families had not eradicated organized crime in New York, but it had changed its texture, scale, and public visibility. For men of Asaro's generation, there were few illusions left about invincibility. Whatever influence he still held was confined to memories and to the limited circles of aging associates who shared his past. The era when a boy from Ozone Park could grow into a neighborhood figure, whose name appeared in both FBI files and mafia initiation rituals was, by the time he sat in his house under supervised release, largely over. By the time Vincent Asaro returned to his house in Queens under supervised release in the spring of 2020, the physical landscape around him still bore traces of the world that had shaped his life. But the underlying reality had changed almost beyond recognition. The low brick homes and narrow driveways of Ozone Park and nearby Howard Beach were still there, as were a few storefronts that had survived the churn of New York retail life. Yet the old Italian dominant character of the neighborhood had steadily given way to a patchwork of communities. South Asian families, Latino immigrants, longtime residents from a range of backgrounds. Social clubs that had once been gathering places for men tied to the Bonanno, Gambino, or Lucchi's families had either closed entirely, been repurposed into ordinary businesses, or operated in far more subdued form. Legally, Asaro's freedom was conditional. Supervised release in the federal system is not an informal arrangement. It comes with written terms and a supervising officer. Travel is restricted. Contact with known felons or organized crime figures is often forbidden. Curfews can be imposed, and unannounced home visits are part of the routine. While specific conditions in his case were detailed in sealed or technical court documents rather than broad news coverage, standard practice suggests that his movements and associations would have been monitored, and any violation could have resulted in his return to custody. At an age when most men are dealing with doctor's visits and grandchildren's school events, his schedule also had to include check-ins with the Federal Probation Office. Publicly available information about his day-to-day life after his release is sparse. He did not become a regular presence in the media, did not publish memoirs, and did not sit for extended documentary interviews. That very absence is telling when set against the pattern of his generation. Many former mob figures from the 1970s and 1980s, men like Henry Hill, Sammy, the Bull Gravano, and others, eventually chose, or were forced into, a kind of half-celebrity status, telling their stories under government protection or in the context of plea deals. By contrast, Asaro remained what he had always been, a neighborhood figure whose notoriety stemmed more from what others said about him in court than from his own willingness to narrate his life. Journalists and organized crime watchers nonetheless continued to refer to him as one of the last significant holdovers from a certain era of the Bonanno family. That family, once one of the most feared and stable of New York's 5 families, had been battered by decades of indictments and betrayals. The Donnie Brasco infiltration of the late 1970s and early 1980s had severely damaged its internal trust and external reputation. The long reign of boss Joseph Massino, who rose from Queens to lead the family in the 1980s and 1990s, had ended in 2003 with his arrest on multiple murder and racketeering charges and his decision to cooperate with the government. His testimony, combined with that of other defectors, laid bare the inner workings of Bonanno crews, their methods of extortion and theft, and their alliances and rivalries with other families. In the wake of Massino's cooperation, the Bonannos experienced a prolonged period of instability. Successive acting bosses, street bosses, and captains were indicted or convicted. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York devoted significant resources to dismantling what remained of the family's leadership structure. Operations that in the 1960s or 1970s would have been quietly resolved on neighborhood corners now risked drawing immediate attention from multi-agency task forces. Younger men considering a life in that world had to weigh not just the risk of arrest, but the near certainty that someone above or beside them might one day become a government witness. Against this backdrop, the figure of an octogenarian captain from Ozone Park took on a certain symbolic resonance. For law enforcement professionals and academic researchers, Asaro's trajectory, from youth in a mafia-saturated neighborhood to middle-age involvement in airport-related schemes, through late-life RICO charges, an unexpected acquittal, and eventual imprisonment for a retaliatory arson, served as a kind of case study. It illustrated both the durability of organized crime culture in certain communities and the way that culture had been forced into a narrower, more precarious space by legal and social change. One aspect of that change was the shifting identity of the communities from which classic Cosa Nostra families had drawn much of their membership. In the first half of the 20th century, Italian-American neighborhoods in New York were often segregated by language and custom from the wider city. Discrimination in employment and housing, coupled with close-knit extended families and mutual aid networks, created conditions in which underground economies could thrive alongside legitimate ones. By the time Asaro returned home in 2020, Italian Americans as a group were far more economically and socially integrated. Many had moved to suburbs or other parts of the country, Their professional lives spanned every sector, from law and medicine to business and government. Community leaders had long worked to combat stereotyped media portrayals that equated Italian identity with organized crime. In that respect, high-profile cases like Asaro's were double-edged for Italian-American communities. On one hand, they confirmed that the old mafia families were aging, shrinking, and under constant pressure from law enforcement. On the other, they re-invoked imagery that many activists and ordinary citizens found frustrating. The coverage of his 2015 trial, with its references to Lufthansa, buried bodies, and Goodfellas, drew on a template that had been repeated since the 1970s Senate hearings on organized crime. National Italian-American organizations issued statements in other contexts, reminding the public that the vast majority of Italian Americans had no connection to such activity, and that criminal organizations were a small, unrepresentative minority within a much larger community. For law enforcement planners, Asaro's story had a different set of lessons. The Lufthansa prosecution, though ending in acquittal, demonstrated the reach of modern investigative techniques, the ability to combine informant testimony, forensic archaeology, and digital analysis to revisit alleged crimes from decades earlier. At the same time, it underscored the limits of such efforts. Memories degrade, records disappear, and the legal standard of proof remains high. The car arson case, by contrast, highlighted how much easier it is to build a strong case around a relatively recent event, especially when telephone records, surveillance video, and phone location data can be marshaled to support cooperating witnesses. Training materials and conferences for investigative agencies in the 2010s often used cases like these as examples, not to dwell on lurid details, but to discuss strategies for targeting entrenched criminal structures without violating civil liberties, the ethics of informant use, and the importance of rigorous evidence handling in long-term probes. In presentations and academic articles, former prosecutors and agents sometimes pointed to the dichotomy in Asaro's legal history as a warning. An over-reliance on a single cooperator, especially one with obvious incentives to embellish, could fatally weaken a high-profile case. But neglecting follow-up on smaller, more readily provable acts, like violent retaliation or arson, could allow dangerous patterns of behavior to continue unchecked. Outside these professional circles, the public memory of Asaro remained heavily filtered through the lens of popular culture. To many people who heard his name only in passing, he was the Lufthansa guy, even though the jury had declared him not guilty on that charge. That disconnect between formal legal outcomes and popular association is hardly unique to his story. Similar patterns can be seen with many notorious cases. But it raises questions that historians and legal scholars often grapple with. How should the legacy of such figures be discussed? Should the emphasis fall on allegations and suspicions that never led to conviction, on the formal record of what courts have found, or on a broader social narrative that includes both? Responsible historical treatment generally tries to navigate carefully between these poles. In the case of Asaro, that means acknowledging the seriousness with which law enforcement viewed his alleged involvement in Lufthansa and the cat's murder, while also emphasizing that under the American legal system he is, and remains, presumed innocent of those particular crimes. It means noting the deterrent and symbolic impact that high-profile indictments can have, even when they do not result in convictions, and contrasting that with the concrete, admitted criminality of the 2012 arson and the earlier, lesser-known offenses documented in court records and investigative reports. The question of redemption, whether someone with a long history in criminal circles can meaningfully change later in life, is also part of the conversation around figures like Asaro, though hard evidence is often difficult to obtain. Some former organized crime participants have left that world behind, taken ordinary jobs, and worked quietly to steer younger family members away from the life that once entangled them. Others have oscillated between periods of apparent calm and bursts of familiar behavior. In Asaro's case, the decision to order the car fire in 2012, when he was already a senior citizen, suggested to many observers that, at least up to that point, his instincts still aligned with the code of retaliation he had absorbed decades earlier. What, if any, shifts occurred in his thinking after his experience of federal prison and pandemic-era compassionate release are not documented in public sources. What can be traced more concretely is the gradual fatting of the world that had once surrounded him. Through the 2010s and into the 2020s, obituaries and court documents marked the passing or imprisonment of many of his contemporaries. Joseph Massino died in 2022. Other longtime Bonanno figures, some of whom had been his peers in Queens operations or his counterparts in Brooklyn, were by then either deceased, incarcerated, or living out their own supervised release terms in relative obscurity. The once rigid hierarchies of Cosa Nostra families had been severely disrupted, not only by legal actions but by broader social changes. Younger generations coming of age with different economic options, a diminished tolerance for the risks and discipline of mafia life, and the growth of other types of criminal organizations, street gangs, drug cartels, cybercrime networks, that competed for attention, resources, and recruits. In New York's criminal justice statistics, the decline of traditional mafia activity showed up less as a sudden collapse than as a long, uneven tapering. Cases involving Cosa Nostra families did not disappear, but they accounted for a far smaller portion of federal dockets than in the 1980s and 1990s. When indictments did come, they tended to focus on smaller crews, more modest rackets, and younger defendants whose names were not yet widely known outside law enforcement circles. The era of sweeping commission, trials, and cinematic scandals was waning. In that context, the attention that still attached to Asaro's name reflected more the lingering fascination of earlier decades than the current weight of the Bonanno organization in New York's criminal landscape. That fascination has much to do with the Lufthansa heist's place in American cultural memory. The robbery's scale, timing, and aftershocks converged with the rise of a new kind of true crime and mafia storytelling in books, magazines, and eventually films. Even people who could not recall the details of the case recognized the rough outline: an enormous sum stolen from an airport vault, a cascade of violent retribution, an enduring mystery about who had planned and profited from it. When Asaro was arrested and charged in connection with that event in 2014, it was almost inevitable that reporters would frame him not just as another alleged mobster, but as the potential key to unlocking a famous unsolved crime. This raised ethical issues for both journalists and audiences. How should long-ago acts of theft and violence be depicted? To what extent does dramatization, whether in films like Goodfellas or in documentary treatments, risk glamorizing or trivializing the harm done to victims and communities? Asaro's case forced these questions back onto the table because it intersected so directly with a crime that had already been extensively fictionalized. Some coverage perhaps leaned too heavily on movie references. Other reporting made a conscious effort to center the voices of airline employees who had lived with trauma from the robbery, or the family members of those who had disappeared in its wake. From the standpoint of historical analysis, carefully distinguishing between what is known, what is alleged, and what is mythologized is crucial. For Lufthansa, that means noting that while law enforcement consensus has long held that Jimmy Burke's crew was central to the heist, and that various other associates and insiders played roles, the full list of participants has never been conclusively established in court. It means acknowledging that Asaro's name entered that narrative through informant accounts and recorded conversations, but that a jury, after hearing all the evidence, was not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. It also means recognizing that the cultural image of Lufthansa now exists partly independent of the underlying facts. a story that has taken on symbolic meaning about greed, betrayal, and the decline of the old mafia order. Within Ozone Park itself, memory operates on a different scale. Neighbors who had known Asaro for decades might remember him less as the man from the headlines and more as the person they saw walking down the block or sitting outside his home on a folding chair. Longtime residents carry their own mental maps of who lived where, who was related to whom, and which houses once served as quiet hubs of underworld activity. Younger residents, particularly those from immigrant communities that arrived in the last 20 or 30 years, may have only a hazy sense that something used to be different about these streets, a reputation inherited but not fully understood. The tension between those intimate, local memories and the broader national narrative is part of what makes cases like Asaro's important to examine carefully. They illuminate how individual lives intersect with structural forces: immigration, economic change, policing strategies, media representation. A boy growing up in mid-century Ozone Park had a very different set of visible role models and perceived opportunities than a teenager in the same neighborhood today. The success stories that circulated then, in some circles, involved men with nicknames who drove big cars and had cash businesses. Now they are more likely to feature college-educated professionals, small business owners from multiple ethnic backgrounds, or public sector workers commuting to jobs across the city. By the early 2020s, with Asaro under supervised release and most of his contemporaries in decline, the long arc of his life could be seen as spanning this entire transformation. Born into an era when the American mafia was consolidating its power, reaching his professional maturity at the height of Cosa Nostra influence in the 1960s and 1970s, enduring the RICO-driven crackdowns and defections of the 1980s and 1990s, and then facing late-life prosecutions in a media-saturated post-Goodfellas world, he became, willingly or not, a reference point for how organized crime's story in New York has often been told. Even so, key aspects of his story remain contested or opaque. He has never publicly given a comprehensive account of his life or offered his own version of many of the episodes attributed to him. Court records provide one angle, government memos and informant debriefings; another, journalistic investigations; a third. Each source has its own biases and limitations. For historians, the lack of a clear, first-person narrative poses both a challenge and a responsibility: to reconstruct events only as far as the evidence allows, and to resist filling in gaps with speculation masquerading as fact. What is left, then, is a fragmented but still telling picture. A man born to an Italian-American family in pre-war New York, a youth spent in a neighborhood where the mafia was a visible, if largely unspoken, presence. Advancement through a criminal hierarchy that specialized in exploiting the vulnerabilities of an expanding airport-based economy. Survival through family wars, undercover infiltrations, and sweeping federal racketeering campaigns. Implication in a legendary heist and a long-buried killing, but acquitted by a jury. Conviction and imprisonment late in life for orchestrating an act of retaliation that reflected old habits more than any grand criminal strategy. And finally, an early release due to a global health crisis that placed his age and frailty in stark relief. As his story moves further into the past, and as new generations grow up for whom Lufthansa is a reference they know only from film or footnote, the lens through which people view Vincent Asaro will continue to shift. Researchers will ask what his life reveals about the mechanics of loyalty and fear within organized crime. Legal scholars will debate what his trials say about the strengths and weaknesses of informant-driven prosecutions. Communities in Queens will measure the distance between the neighborhoods they know and the ones described in old FBI reports. And somewhere in that intersection of law, culture, and memory, the outline of a life lived in the shadow of power and punishment will remain. A reminder that the history of crime is also, inescapably, a history of places, families, and choices made under particular pressures at particular times. In the quiet that followed his return to Queens under supervised release, Vincent Asaro lived out his last years as a kind of living relic, someone whose presence on a neighborhood street corner evoked an era most New Yorkers now knew only from documentaries and films. He was in his 80s, moving more slowly, often described as frail in the few passing mentions that appeared in the press. The legal battles that had defined the previous decade were, for him, largely finished. The Lufthansa case was closed as far as the courts were concerned. The arson sentence had been cut short by compassionate release. Yet his name continued to function as a shorthand in news stories and law enforcement discussions, an emblem for a certain type of old-world mobster who had managed to survive into the 21st century. Part of that lingering fascination stemmed from what he had not done as much as from what he had. Over the past 40 years, a long list of high-ranking mafia figures had made the decision to cooperate with authorities. Bosses and underbosses who had once presided over killings, extortion, and multi-million-dollar rackets found themselves facing life sentences and chose to testify in exchange for reduced punishment and entry into witness protection programs. Their testimony helped prosecutors dismantle traditional structures of power within the five families and produced a detailed public record of internal rules, disputes, and business arrangements. Asaro never joined their ranks. He maintained, to the end of his life, a refusal to become a government witness. He had admitted his role in the 2012 arson as part of a plea agreement, but that was not the same as turning informant. He did not sit down for debriefing sessions in which he named associates, revealed hidden bodies, or recounted secret meetings in exchange for protection. For younger investigators accustomed to a world in which high-level cooperators were a routine part of complex cases, this refusal could seem almost archaic. For older agents and prosecutors who had spent careers dealing with an earlier generation of mobsters, it was more familiar, an adherence, however flawed, to the code of silence that had once been the defining rule of Cosa Nostra life. That choice had consequences for how his story can be told. With figures like Joseph Massino or Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, historians and journalists can compare self-serving insider accounts with independent evidence, parsing where they align and where they diverge. With Asaro, there is no such primary narrative. The only extensive record of his voice comes in the form of recorded conversations made by Gaspar Valenti at the government's direction, and the sparse, carefully lawyered statements made in court. Even his allocution in the arson case was tightly focused on the specific elements of that crime. It did not range broadly over his life or motives. As a result, much of what we know must be reconstructed from surrounding context. The testimony of others, investigative files, the evolution of the Bonanno family, and the visible contours of his legal battles. What emerges from that reconstruction is not a story of spectacular innovation or unprecedented cunning, but of durability. Asaro's career illustrates how organized crime can embed itself in particular places and industries, and then adapt, sometimes slowly and imperfectly, to shifting economic and legal realities. In his youth and early adulthood, the airport and its surrounding trucking and warehouse infrastructure provided the primary opportunities. Hijackings, cargo theft, schemes with union contacts and corrupt insiders. Later, as heightened security and digital tracking made large-scale thefts from airlines more difficult, other rackets, illegal gambling, loan sharking, construction-related schemes, continued to generate income. By the time he was facing his last federal sentence, those rackets had already been significantly curtailed by decades of law enforcement work. RICO prosecutions had targeted the leadership of the five families. Long-term undercover operations had eroded trust within crews, and demographic changes had reduced the mafia's ability to draw new recruits from culturally homogeneous, economically marginalized neighborhoods. Yet the instinctive response that led Asaro to order a car set on fire over a perceived insult in traffic suggested that, at least for him, the core mentality of the life, using fear and destruction to assert status, remained intact. That mentality inflicted harm on people who had never chosen or even understood the world he came from. The anonymous Lufthansa employees forced to the floor in 1978 carried the memory of that night's terror long after the headlines faded, even if they could never identify the masked men involved. Paul Katz's family spent decades not knowing what had happened to him, only to be confronted in 2013 with the discovery of his remains and the reopening of old wounds. The homeowner whose Jaguar burned in front of his house in Howard Beach awoke to an inferno that could easily have claimed lives. For him and his family, it was not some vestigial performance of mob culture, but a direct, frightening violation of their safety. These victims rarely became central characters in media accounts. The structure of true crime storytelling and legal reporting tends to emphasize perpetrators and investigators. The wise guy, the FBI agent, the prosecutor delivering a closing argument. Victims' experiences appear in court testimony and victim impact statements, but once trials conclude, they often recede into the background. In assessing Asaro's legacy, however, it is crucial to bring them back into view. Whatever else can be said about the codes of loyalty and belonging in his world, they rested on practices that produced fear, loss, and in some cases permanent trauma for people far outside that circle. His late-life prosecution also shed light on how the justice system handles aging defendants with long criminal histories. Traditionally, age and poor health could cut both ways at sentencing. Defense lawyers argued that a lengthy term for someone in their 70s or 80s was tantamount to life in prison. Prosecutors countered that such defendants had often spent decades evading serious consequences, and that late-in-life punishment still served important goals of accountability and deterrence. In Asaro's arson case, the judge's decision to impose 8 years despite his age signaled a refusal to treat advanced years as a shield, especially when the crime itself had been committed by a man already in his mid-70s. The arrival of COVID-19 complicated this calculus in ways no one had anticipated. Compassionate release, historically rare and often limited to prisoners who were terminally ill or physically incapacitated, became a more widely used mechanism as courts grappled with the heightened risk the virus posed to older and medically fragile inmates. The decision to grant Asaro such a release did not erase his guilt or suggest that his sentence had been mistaken. Rather, it acknowledged that the conditions under which the sentence was being served had changed dramatically. For scholars and practitioners of criminal law, his case became one of many data points in an ongoing debate about how punishment should adapt, or not adapt, to unforeseen crises. Beyond the courthouse, his story fed into broader discussions about the long-term effectiveness of the campaign against the American mafia. By the time of his final release, few doubted that the government's multi-decade strategy had significantly weakened the five families. Their hold over key industries had been broken, their capacity for large-scale corruption and violence reduced, their aura of invincibility shattered by television images of bosses in handcuffs and cooperator testimony detailing life as it was behind the myth. Yet organized crime in general had not disappeared. It had splintered and diversified into new forms, from transnational drug cartels and Eastern European gangs to cyber-enabled fraud networks. When experts examined Asaro's path, they often contrasted it with these newer models. The traditional Cosa Nostra structure, hierarchical, ethnically defined, reliant on face-to-face meetings and paper-thin legitimate fronts, left deep archival traces that investigators could follow. The Lufthansa case, even in failure, showed how the combination of informants, forensic science, and RICO could be used to reach back in time and attempt to hold participants accountable. By contrast, some contemporary criminal enterprises operate in more fluid digital ways, leaving behind encrypted communications and global financial flows rather than physical meeting places and social clubs. For residents of Ozone Park and similar neighborhoods, these large-scale shifts played out alongside more immediate concerns: rising rents, school quality, local crime rates driven more by ordinary street violence or economic stress than by mafia intrigue. Some long-time Italian-American residents looked back at the mid-20th century years with a kind of selective nostalgia, remembering tight-knit blocks and familiar corner stores, while downplaying or ignoring the shadow economy that had coexisted with that sense of community. For immigrant families who arrived later from Guyana, Bangladesh, the Dominican Republic, or elsewhere, the remnants of that older underworld were barely relevant to their daily struggles and ambitions. In this changing environment, Asaro's presence, an old man associated in headlines with Lufthansa, Bonanno, and mob road rage, sometimes felt almost out of time. Younger people in the neighborhood who recognized his name might do so more from internet searches or streaming service documentaries than from lived experience. Some saw him as a curiosity, others as a reminder that certain patterns of power and intimidation, though weakened, had not entirely vanished. When he walked his block, under the constraints of supervised release, he embodied a continuity that the built environment around him only partly reflected. In 2023, according to news reports, Vincent Asaro died at the age of 86. The cause and circumstances of his death were not the subject of extended public discussion. There were no sensational headlines comparable to those that had greeted his 2014 arrest or his 2015 acquittal. His passing was noted briefly in some outlets that had covered his earlier trials, framed in terms of his alleged connection to the Lufthansa heist and his role in the Bonanno family. To the extent that public reaction registered at all, it was muted. By then, the COVID-19 pandemic had left deep scars on New York, and attention had long since shifted to other crises and other stories. In Ozone Park, his death closed a chapter in the neighborhood's unwritten history. For people who had known him personally, it may have been felt simply as the loss of an elderly relative, friend, or neighbor. For law enforcement veterans who had spent careers tracking mob figures through surveillance photos and wiretap transcripts, it marked the passing of one of the last active participants in a specific generation of Cosa Nostra life. Whatever secrets he had kept about airport schemes, internal disputes, uncharged acts went with him. His funeral, by the fragmentary accounts that filtered into the press, appears to have been relatively low-key compared to the lavish send-offs once associated with mafia bosses in the 1970s and 1980s, when floral displays and long processions of black cars drew spectators and photographers. The diminished scale reflected not only law enforcement scrutiny of such gatherings, but also the shrinkage of that old social world. There were fewer surviving contemporaries to attend, fewer younger men eager to be seen paying respects, fewer bystanders for whom the appearance of known mob figures at a church or funeral home was still a spectacle. For historians, the closing of a life like Asaro's raises questions about how best to situate him in the larger narrative of American crime and justice. One approach is to treat him primarily as an instrument, a node in networks of theft, extortion, and violence, whose main significance lies in the light his activities shed on institutional structures. From this angle, the focus falls on the Bonanno family's role in airport rackets, the inner workings of Lufthansa-related crews, the impact of RICO prosecutions, and the social ecology of Queens in the mid-20th century. His particular personality becomes less important than his function within those broader systems. Another approach is more biographical, emphasizing the specificity of his path, the family dynamics that brought him into contact with underworld figures, the decisions that led him to stay in that world rather than seek legitimate work, the personal relationships that both protected him and eventually helped bring him under indictment. This lens invites comparison with others from his generation, who faced similar circumstances but made different choices. Those who rejected the lure of mob life, those who entered it briefly and left, those who, when confronted with long sentences, chose to cooperate rather than maintain silence. Both approaches have value, and neither fully captures the complexity of a life lived in the gray zone between community respectability and criminal enterprise. What does emerge clearly, however, is that his story cannot be detached from the specificities of time and place. Without the creation and expansion of JFK Airport, there would have been no particular niche for airport-focused crews from Queens. Without the earlier history of Sicilian immigration and the building of social networks that blended kinship with criminal association, his rise within the Bonanno hierarchy would have been far less likely. Without the legal innovations of RICO and the strategic shifts within the FBI and U.S. attorneys' offices, the last decades of his life would probably have played out in semi-obscurity rather than in federal courtrooms. Even his late life experience of prison and pandemic-era release reflects these larger currents. The availability of compassionate release, the increased use of supervised release conditions, the prioritization of certain defendants for COVID-driven sentence modification, all are products of recent changes in criminal justice policy. A mob figure of his generation who had been sentenced in the 1960s or 1970s would not have had access to similar mechanisms. In this sense, Asaro's final years, spent under home confinement in a city locked down by a virus, were shaped as much by 21st century public health debates as by any underworld code. The tension between myth and record will likely continue to shape how he is remembered. To a portion of the audience, his name will always be tied to Lufthansa, regardless of the acquittal, because popular culture has fused that crime with a handful of personalities and archetypes. To others, particularly those versed in the legal details, he will stand as an example of the limits of informant-dependent prosecutions and the challenges of trying to turn decades-old investigations into convincing courtroom narratives. Among some Italians and Italian-Americans critical of media stereotyping, his story may surface in arguments about the disproportionate attention given to a small criminal minority compared to the broader community's contributions. What remains constant across these perspectives is the recognition that his life belonged to a now receding chapter of American urban history. The visual markers of that chapter, men in open, collared shirts clustered in front of social clubs, whispered conversations in the back of cafes, union cards wielded as both protection and leverage, have largely given way to different forms of power and exclusion. Yet the underlying questions his story raises endure: how marginalized communities respond to limited opportunity, how law enforcement strategies can both disrupt criminal structures and inadvertently strengthen them, how individuals navigate the pull between loyalty to a group and accountability to a larger society. In tracing the arc from his childhood in pre-war Queens to his death in the 2020s, one sees not just the biography of a single man, but the imprint of 80 years of change in American cities, immigrant communities, law, and media. The boy who grew up watching certain men command cautious respect on his block became, in turn, one of those men. The older man who sat in a federal courtroom listening to allegations about Lufthansa and long-buried bones carried in his posture the residue of that inherited authority. His eventual fall, from the glamour of a sensational indictment to the more prosaic reality of a prison medical ward, and a quiet, supervised final chapter, mirrors the broader deflation of the mafia's once towering place in the American imagination. With his passing, the opportunity for fuller first-person testimony about that world narrows. The archives of the future will contain more digital traces, scanned FBI reports, streamed court hearings, online news coverage, but fewer living voices from the generation that built and maintained the old structures of organized crime in mid-century New York. For those seeking to understand that history, the challenge will be to use the record that exists, legal documents, journalistic investigations, academic studies, to tell stories that neither romanticize nor flatten, that acknowledge both the damage done and the social realities that made such lives possible. In that work, Vincent Asaro will likely remain a recurring figure, not because he was uniquely powerful or virtuous or monstrous, but because his life intersected, again and again, with the fault lines where law, loyalty, and memory meet. Decades from now, when researchers look back on the story of Vincent Asaro, they will not encounter a neat, linear narrative laid out in a single diary or memoir. Instead, they will find fragments, court transcripts full of formal language and ritualized questions, FBI reports written in the clipped, analytic prose of surveillance summaries, newspaper articles shaped by deadlines and the need for a compelling lead, snatches of dialogue captured on concealed microphones, occasional neighborhood recollections framed by the inevitable distortions of memory. From this patchwork, they will try to reconstruct what it meant for one man to live a life so deeply entangled with both the ordinary rhythms of a Queens neighborhood and the clandestine structures of a mafia family. Their work will begin, as it always must, with the most solid anchors, dates and documents. A birth in New York in the late 1930s into an Italian-American family with roots in Sicily. Early years spent in Ozone Park, a community where the Bonanno crime family had deep roots, and where the opening and expansion of Idlewild, later JFK Airport, created both legitimate jobs and criminal possibilities. Mentions of his name in law enforcement files beginning in the 1960s, as investigators started to map which crews controlled which corners of Queens. The shift, visible in charging documents and internal memoranda, from describing him as an associate to a made member, and eventually a captain within the Bonanno hierarchy. Those researchers will see how the arc of his life aligns with the rise, peak, and gradual weakening of the American mafia. When he was a child, the 5 New York families were still consolidating the structure that had emerged from the turmoil of the Castellammare War, and the reorganization led by figures like Lucky Luciano and Mayor Lansky. By his 20s and 30s, the Bonannos and their counterparts had become embedded in unions, construction, waterfront operations, and crucially for someone in his geographic orbit, the airport and its surrounding warehouse districts. The FBI's own posture shifted across these same years, from skepticism about the existence of a coherent mafia to the development of dedicated organized crime squads and the eventual deployment of RICO as a central tool. In that sense, Asaro's story is not just one biography among many, but a thread woven through a larger tapestry of institutional change. Whenever his name appears in a report, it sits alongside the acronyms of new laws and initiatives: OCDETF, Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Forces; Title III wiretaps, grand jury subpoenas, cooperation agreements. The narrative of his life cannot be separated from the evolution of these tools, nor from the broader transformations in New York's economy and demographics that shaped where criminal opportunity existed and how it was perceived. Consider, for instance, the centrality of JFK Airport to his alleged criminal activities. Historians of American infrastructure and labor will note that airports began as relatively small, experimental facilities in the early 20th century, and by the 1960s and 1970s had become massive, complex hubs upon which global commerce depended. Cargo moved in staggering quantities through warehouses and handling centers whose security practices lagged behind the value of the goods they contained. That gap between value and protection created the conditions in which airport crews could thrive. For someone like Asaro, living only a short drive away, the airport represented not the glamour of jet-age travel, but a system that could be studied, infiltrated, and exploited. The Lufthansa heist, for all its later mythologizing, can be viewed in this light, not as an isolated stroke of criminal genius, but as the peak expression of an ongoing pattern of cargo theft and inside job robberies. The fact that law enforcement, even given years of effort and eventual cooperation from participants like Henry Hill, never succeeded in fully resolving the case in court, underscores the limits of investigative power when crimes are carefully planned and committed in tight circles of trusted associates. When prosecutors finally brought Lufthansa-related charges against Asaro in 2014, they did so in a context where much of the physical evidence was long gone, witnesses had died, and memory had inevitably frayed. For future analysts, his 2015 trial will stand as a rich primary source on both the possibilities and constraints of late-in-time justice. The transcripts offer a window into how prosecutors marshal aging evidence, how defense attorneys dismantle an informant's credibility, and how juries respond when asked to decide questions about acts that occurred 30-plus years before. The acquittal on all major counts will be parsed for what it reveals about the standard of proof, about juror skepticism toward heavily incentivized cooperators, and about the way in which the cultural fame of a crime like Lufthansa can work both for and against the government's case. The same record reveals something about the internal culture of the Bonanno family and the personal code that Asaro appears to have followed, that he never agreed to cooperate with the government, even in the face of a potentially devastating RICO case, places him among a shrinking group of long-time mob figures who adhered to omerta to the end. For sociologists and criminologists studying deviance and group loyalty, this fact will be of interest. What distinguishes those who, when pressured, transform into state witnesses from those who accept the risk of long sentences rather than break with their group's norms? Is it simply a matter of opportunity and self-interest, or do deeply internalized notions of identity and honor play a role? His later guilty plea in the 2012 arson case complicates any romantic notion of steadfastness. There, he did not contest the core allegation, that he had ordered a car burned in retaliation for a perceived slight. But pleading guilty to a specific offense is not the same as renouncing an entire worldview or nomming names. Rather, it can be seen as a tactical concession, a recognition, likely advised by counsel, that the evidence on that discrete point was overwhelming, and that a negotiated plea was preferable to the uncertainty of a trial in which technology-based evidence and recent witness testimony would loom large. The contrast between the two cases, sweeping historical RICO on the one hand, focused contemporary arson on the other, will likely serve as a teaching example in law schools and criminal justice programs. In seminars on federal prosecutions, students may examine how the same defendant could be beyond the reach of conviction for allegedly major crimes decades earlier, but vulnerable to substantial punishment for a relatively minor, if still serious, offense committed late in life. Questions will be raised about resource allocation. Should years of investigative effort be expended on resurrecting older cases whose evidentiary foundations are inherently shaky? Or should priority be given to quickly and firmly prosecuting more recent, documentable misconduct? From another angle, Asaro's life invites reflection on the impact of organized crime on the communities in which it embeds itself. Ozone Park, Howard Beach, and similar neighborhoods are sometimes portrayed in media accounts as almost monolithically defined by mob presence, but the lived reality was more nuanced. For every social club linked to a Bonanno or Gambino crew, there were schools, churches, grocery stores, playgrounds where ordinary life unfolded. Families like Asaro's lived side by side with families who wanted nothing to do with illicit activity. Some residents may have felt that mafia figures provided a kind of rough order or protection. Others viewed them as sources of fear, extortion, and the occasional burst of spectacular violence that shattered the peace of a block. Urban historians and ethnographers, looking back, will likely emphasize this coexistence of ordinary and illicit economies. They will note how mob-connected businesses, auto body shops, bars, small construction firms, operated alongside and entangled with legitimate enterprises, sometimes providing jobs in cash economies where immigration status or lack of formal education limited opportunities, but also perpetuating cycles of dependency and vulnerability. They may interview second and third generation residents who recall parents warning them, explicitly or implicitly, about which people to avoid and which places to steer clear of after dark. For Italian-American communities more broadly, the story of someone like Asaro sits at the intersection of pride in immigrant striving and frustration with enduring stereotypes. Advocacy organizations have long pointed out that a tiny proportion of Italian Americans ever engaged in organized crime, yet media portrayals disproportionately emphasize mob narratives. In this context, every high-profile case becomes a double event, a necessary confrontation with real criminality, and a renewed opportunity for lazy cultural shorthand. Future scholars of ethnicity and media will likely use coverage of Asaro's prosecutions as one of many examples in a larger study of how certain groups become associated in the public imagination with particular forms of deviance or glamour. The other side of that coin is the enduring appeal of gangster stories in American culture. Books and films have made figures like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, John Gotti, and yes, composite characters inspired by men like Jimmy Burke and his associates into recognizable icons. The Lufthansa heist functions in this genre almost as a mythic episode, a symbol of audacity and betrayal. When an actual person stands accused in connection with such a story, the boundary between history and entertainment can blur. Responsible documentary filmmaking and scholarship must work actively against that blurring, insisting on centering victims, avoiding sensationalized language, and stressing the difference between dramatized scenes and the often prosaic, ugly realities of organized crime. In that regard, Asaro's life is a useful corrective to romantic narratives. The details that emerge from court records, an older man angry enough over a traffic slight to set in motion an arson, decades of involvement in loan sharking and illegal gambling that trap people in cycles of debt, alleged participation, unproven in court, in a killing born of paranoia about informants, do not add up to a noble outlaw. They depict a pattern of choices in which personal affronts and profit were often prioritized over the safety and stability of others. The longevity of his career speaks not to exceptional virtue or intelligence, but to the resilience of criminal subcultures in exploiting institutional blind spots and local loyalties. This is not to deny the human complexity that those close to him attested to in letters and interviews. Family members saw a different set of behaviors, a grandfather doting on grandchildren, a neighbor helping with small tasks, a man who, in private settings, could be generous and protective. The coexistence of these traits with his criminal life is not unique to him. It is common in many contexts where individuals compartmentalize roles, loving parent at home, ruthless actor in another domain. For moral philosophers and psychologists, this duality raises questions about how people justify harmful actions to themselves, and how affection and loyalty within a small circle can coexist with indifference or hostility toward those outside it. Looking at the end of his life, with supervised release replacing prison time due to pandemic-related compassionate release, scholars of punishment and mercy will find much to analyze. They will see courts grappling with how to apply fixed sentences in a world where external conditions, here, a global virus, alter the meaning and risk of incarceration. They will ask whether the leniency extended to an elderly mob figure was also extended equitably to other categories of prisoners, including those convicted of non-violent offenses with far less extensive criminal histories. They may compare data on compassionate release grants across demographic lines, examining whether some groups benefited disproportionately from judicial discretion. At the same time, they will have to acknowledge that by the time of his release, Asaro's capacity to personally shape the criminal landscape of New York had dwindled. The institutions that had once empowered him were shadows of their former selves. The Bonanno family he served had been repeatedly decapitated and infiltrated. The airport economy that he and his contemporaries had exploited was guarded by layers of digital tracking and security protocols unimaginable in the 1960s. Younger generations of would-be criminals gravitated toward cyber fraud, synthetic drug markets, or transnational networks that bore little resemblance to the world of neighborhood crews and handshake agreements. In this way, his story becomes a hinge between eras. On one side lies the world of post-war, ethnically defined organized crime in a heavily industrial city, a world of social clubs, union rackets, and cash-heavy small businesses. On the other lies a 21st century landscape in which crime is more dispersed, more technologically mediated, and less tied to a single ethnic narrative. The archival trace of his life can thus be read as a closing chapter in one volume of American criminal history, even as new volumes begin to be written about very different kinds of illicit enterprise. Ultimately, the significance of Vincent Asaro's life is less about any single act and more about the series of intersections it represents. He stood at the intersection of an immigrant community and a criminal organization that both drew on and betrayed that community's bonds. He existed at the junction of an expanding global infrastructure, JFK Airport, and local street-level schemes that siphoned off value and generated risk. He became a focal point where legal innovation, via RICO and long-term investigations, clashed with the enduring difficulties of proving old crimes. He occupied a place in the cultural imagination where Hollywood narratives about heists and gangsters collided with the slower, messier processes of real courtrooms. For viewers of a documentary about his life, or readers of a historical study that uses his case as a lens, the challenge is to hold these intersections in view without succumbing to either glamorization or oversimplification. It requires seeing the damage done, to victims, to neighborhoods, to public trust, while also understanding the social forces that made organized crime seem, to some, like a viable path. It requires respecting the jury's role in acquitting him of certain charges, while acknowledging that acquittal does not erase the broader pattern of involvement that multiple sources, including his own guilty plea in the arson case, confirm. As time passes and the generation to which he belonged fades from living memory, the sharp outlines of his story will likely soften. Lufthansa will remain as a cultural reference point. The name Bonanno will still appear in histories of the mafia's American period. But the man who once walked out of a Brooklyn courthouse declared not guilty in a case the government had invested years in pursuing. The man who later sat in a prison medical facility as a pandemic raged. The man who grew up on the streets of Ozone Park when propeller planes were still new will recede into the background of a larger mosaic. The value of revisiting his life lies not in elevating him as an anti-hero, nor in pretending that his choices were inevitable, but in using his trajectory to ask better questions about how societies respond to crime, how communities shape and are shaped by illicit economies, and how law and culture evolve in tandem. In that sense, the story of Vincent Asaro is ultimately less a tale about one man than about the city that produced him, the institutions that pursued him, and the many people whose lives intersected with his, knowingly or not, across the long and complicated span of 20th and early 21st century New York.